Chapter 3 of Brother, I'm Dying by Edwige Danticat. What did the white man say? I told my parents I was pregnant in my father's car on the way to the airport. It was more than a week after I learned my father's diagnosis, but whenever I found myself alone with him and my mother, I simply couldn't find the words. I came close to telling them the night before I had to return to Miami. I was sitting on my father's bed watching television when my mother came in and sat down on the edge of the bed next to me. I opened my mouth and thought the words came out, but they hadn't. The time limit on the car ride would make it easier, I told myself. If I wanted to tell them in person, there would be no other opportunity to do so. This is not the first time I was sharing important news with my parents in this way. I had rattled off the list of colleges I'd been accepted to in the car one Sunday morning on the way to church. I'd announced my engagement on the way to a cousin's wedding one Saturday afternoon. This manner of sharing important information annoyed my father, who, before his diagnosis, had never mentioned anything monumental in a casual way. "We have to chat," he'd announced days before actually sharing news. "There's something we need to discuss," he'd remind me hours later. "Let me know when you have some time," he'd say, until we'd finally sit down for a brief but formal talk. The best place for me to make my announcement would have been at the family meeting the week before. This is probably what both my parents would have expected and preferred rather than my spitting something out and scurrying off. But that night I couldn't look into my father's face, and though I knew it would come very naturally to him and my mother both, ask that they be happy for me. The trip from my parents' house to the airport normally takes about half an hour at midday. I allowed 10 minutes to lapse while waiting for my father to catch his breath from the effort of walking from the house to his car. "I can take a cab, Papa," I said as I piled in ahead of my mother, who didn't drive, but even if she did, would have probably not been given the wheel by my father. His body hunched over, my father placed his head close to the dashboard. He was still panting and unable to reply, but shook his head in protest as he fired up the ignition. Before he became sick, I might have said of my father that driving for him was like breathing. The night before, I had calculated that from 1981 to 2004, working an average of 10 hours a day, including holidays, but not Sundays, he'd spent nearly 75,000 hours driving the streets of Brooklyn. I knew my father had momentarily recovered from the panting when he asked what my mother had cooked for me to take back with me to Miami. Whenever I visited my parents, my mother would send me back with an overnight bag filled with food. She'd wake up early in the morning of my trip to make sure I had several containers filled with fried snapper, sweet potato cake, codfish patties, a large bag of plantain chips, and several packages of cassava bread. My mother, opulently full-figured, broad-shouldered, always presented me as this bounty at the very last minute, sometimes as we pulled up to the curb at the airport. Her food and my uncle's ride were part of a send-off that often left me feeling guilty and scared, guilty for leaving them behind and scared that something awful, a stroke or a heart attack, might befall them in my absence. "What did your mother give you this time?" my father asked. Having watched my mother pack the bag of food, we knew, but we asked anyways, as we always did, in a half-joking manner, in part to tease my mother about her longing, which she'd perhaps carried since I was a child, to feed me from afar. I told them between the winding narrow lanes of the Jackie Robinson Parkway. My father's old red Lincoln was too wide for one lane, especially at the curves, so he took up both lanes, angering drivers who couldn't pass him. Gripping the wheel tightly, he seemed to block the other drivers out as they honked loudly and poked their heads out of windows to curse him. As my father zigzagged around curves with an angry army of drivers behind him, I told them. I think now that this showed a great deal of confidence in his driving. I must have trusted completely that nothing could have an impact on it. "I have some news," I began. My father was sitting on a square cushion to shield his bony bottom from the painful bumps on the roads, his elbow leaning on the armrest separating him from my mother and me. My voice cracked. All of a sudden, I couldn't help but think of an alternate scenario, making this happy announcement to an unsick father. Perhaps we might still have found ourselves driving on a curvy road on the way to an airport, but my only unease might have been the mild sense of embarrassment one feels having a sex-related conversation, however celebratory, with one's parents. "I'm pregnant," I mumbled. "Ça blonde on dit?" asked my mother. What did the blonde say?" This was the way my mother always let my brothers and me know she hadn't heard or understood something we'd said. The equivalent of a gringo, a blonde, was not just a white man, but any foreigner, especially one who spoke the type of halting and hesitant Creole that my brothers and I sometimes spoke with our parents. "Ça blonde on dit?" in our house meant, "I can't hear you. What did you say?" My father, however, had heard me clearly. "Grandchild," he said to my mother, while giving me a sideways high five. "Oh, I knew you were pregnant," my mother said, clapping her short, wide hands together. "I saw it in a dream." "More like fantasy," my father said, "a wish." "It was a dream," my mother said, turning to me. "I saw you holding a baby, and no one was asking you whose it was." The rest of the ride was spent on advice that both my parents would repeat throughout my pregnancy. My mother told me to see a doctor as soon as possible. My father ordered me to stop traveling, get plenty of rest, and try to relax. On the curb at the airport, my father got out of the car to hug me. He was breathing hard when he reached down to touch my still flat belly. "Don't make her sad," my mother said in a way that was partly brusque and partly playful, which was how she often spoke. "She's going to be on that plane alone." "It's not a private plane, is it?" my father teased, even while trying to catch his breath. Not wanting him to stand much longer, I gave each of my parents a hug, then grabbed my luggage and rushed away. From the airport lobby, I saw my father slowly slide behind the wheel and lower his head to cough and cough and cough. Sometimes when he coughed really hard, tears would stream down his face that he would not even notice. Now I could see my mother reaching over and wiping his face with her palm. A strapping policeman walked up to my father's car and motioned for him to move. As the other passengers walked to their check-in lines, I watched my father, still out of breath, drive away.